Hey everybody, how's it going? Today we're going to be taking a look at an incredibly devious line that you can use against 1 to e4. And apologies in advance if I'm a little bit nasally. I'm recovering from a cold, so I might not sound quite right in this one, but I really wanted to get this one out because this is a really cool trap that works about 87.5% of the time. And it's something that starts with e4, pawn to d5, the Scandinavian defense. And this is kind of an opening that has a lot of tricks and traps. And after the opponent takes on d5, we are going to be focusing on the line with knight to f6, trying to take back this pawn, not with our queen, but rather with our knight. And here there's a lot of popular moves for white, the most popular of all being pawn to d5. And here, if you want to do some independent research, I will advise you that this is where you can play the Portuguese defense. A lot of people have had a fun time. They've been telling me lately this one seems to be popular again, but we are going to be focused instead today on this move, knight takes d5. And the most popular move here from white is pawn to c4. And this is where we are able to set our trap, because when the opponent plays c4, they're expecting us to go back, probably to f6, but maybe to b6. White has said, I attack your knight, you gotta go back. But instead of going back, we are boldly going forward into our opponent's territory with this move, knight to b4. And this is where it might feel like it's actually black that has made a large mistake, and it's white that has an opportunity to find a quick win, but not so fast, because if our opponents play queen to a4 with the idea that now, however we defend this knight, probably not by dropping this guy back, let's try to develop another piece to c6. Let's play knight 8 to c6. This is where opponents tend to make a very large mistake, and I just want to share this position in the database. So here I got the Lee Chess database with you. You can see that this has been played about 12,000 total times on leechess.org, and over 10,000 times, or 87.5% of all of the games, opponents have played d5, because of course, this is the move that makes it really look like white has just won an entire night, but not so fast. Let's pop on Stockfish here and see what's going on. Stockfish says it's all of a sudden minus 1.5 because black has an absolutely incredible move in this position. And the move that our opponents has missed is this move, pawn to b5, and the idea of this one is to remove either the queen or the pawn from their defensive duties, and this is where things are about to take a very interesting turn. So we are going to be deep diving into both of these moves and seeing what happens if a pawn takes, if a queen takes. Now, let's go ahead and start our investigations with what happens if the opponents do decide to take on b5 with the queen. Now, this is an interesting decision because you are allowing black to hop in to c2. This is something that our opponents have allowed, but they figure they have some counterplay because they are still, of course, attacking this knight on c6. So this is a kind of situation that could get very interesting, and there's a lot of opportunities for both sides to mess it up. So pay close attention. After the knight goes into c2, let's say white plays king to d1. This seems to be the most logical move because you're attacking the knight, and you're therefore just expecting that the knight will move. And actually, if we do kind of play along and we just let white kind of dictate what's happening and we decide to take this rook, we might end up in a position that is not entirely clear, because now white can take back on c6, and after we get out of it, just simply move the queen away, and even though we are technically in exchange up in this position, our knight is actually a bit trapped, so it's very likely that we're going to be losing this knight, and it's no longer clear that we have a major advantage. What are we going to do? We're probably just going to develop and get castled and try to act like nothing's really happening, but we need to be able to do a little bit better than this. So if we come back to this position, where after the queen is taken, we've decided to play knight to c2. After the king goes to d1, we, instead of taking the rook right away, want to play an incredibly clever move. And this is definitely something that a lot of opponents will not see coming. It's this crazy move, bishop to d7, and we're just simply ignoring the fact that the knight is attacked. We're saying my knight is actually tactically immune from being captured, and if you take my knight, you're going to be opening up the d file, which could be very devastating. And these are both true statements if you do decide to take this knight on c2. Oh, you gotta watch out for all of these forks. This is like a typical pattern in these positions. There's always these kinds of forks that we're looking for with the black pieces, so this would be impossible for the opponents. But what happens if they just decide to take on c6? Well, again, it looks like a situation where white has now taken one minor piece, and potentially white can get to a position where they have three minor pieces for a queen. Like, for example, if we just take on c6, we are going to win the queen, but white can argue, I've already taken one knight, I'll take another knight, and after you take my queen, I'll be able to take your bishop, and all of a sudden we get to a position where it is actually technically equal material, but more importantly, we have just lost our entire attack. Black no longer has a strong attack against the king, and white is going to be able to come up with a nice safe defense. So this is something that we actually do want to avoid. So when we're here, like, what was the point? Why did we give up our knight in this way? Well, we actually have a much stronger move with this bishop, and that move is bishop to g4, and this is the winning idea for black because it's a double check forcing white's hands. Our knight is defending this square, so the only move available for the black king is to play king takes c2, and all of a sudden you're up two knights with white. But after you see the move queen to d1, you realize just how much trouble white might potentially be in, because the king now has again only one move, king to c3. You can take this bishop at this moment, and now the king needs to be very careful. You would not want to go to the d file and allow our rook to come over and give you a check, so you need to decide which way you're going to go on the queen side. And most players would go to b3, which is actually another mistake. This is now a mate in 6, but b3 makes sense because you're covering this b pawn so that the queen is not able to take on b2. However, you've allowed bishop to d1, and you're getting yourself into a lot of trouble because now you have to go to one of these dark squares that's on the same diagonal as our bishop. So we can move our e-pawn one or two squares, however we like to do it, and all of a sudden the king is just simply getting checkmated. You cannot use this b-pawn to shield because you are in a pin, and at some moment you will be forced to give away your queen. So something like this is checkmate. It's also a beautiful checkmate because you can bring the queen all the way back and deliver a checkmate from the first rank. So something like that just simply doesn't work out. And also, after the bishop goes to g4, the other defense for white would be to instead, after running to here, allowing us to take this bishop, to run to b4. This would be a slightly more tenacious defense. After we take this pawn, attacking the rook, giving the check, the king is able to run all the way to the a5 square. Well, in this position, we are clearly winning because we have just won some material, but just to give you some advice in case you happen to get to a position like this, how would you actually win it? Well, after, for example, a4, it's important to note that this queen is actually a bit tied down to where she is exactly. We can gain pressure by attacking this a4 pawn, preventing the queen from going to either of these two squares, and then forcing the queen to move. For example, we could start with this move bishop to d1, and in some position, let's just move our pawn so that we're able to defend this square. After whatever normal developing moves for white, we might be able to get to a position where the queen can no longer defend a4. So the purpose of our moves were to keep a bishop here, and all of a sudden, if the queen were to ever move, you would just be getting checkmated. So black is going to be winning even more material, and something like that is just a clean win for us. Now, let's come back. Let's run it all the way from the top. And let's see what else white might consider. Now, from this position, we again played knight 8 to c6, and after d5, b5 is the way to go. Now, more likely than not, opponents will be actually taking with this pawn, and this does seem to be a little bit more sensible, or it's at least at first sight easier to understand, that the queen stays on a4, where she is able to defend against this c2 check in most occasions. But also, we have temporarily broken this pin, so if we wanted to, we could now move our knight. And this is actually a position where black has two different potential moves. I will point out that knight to d4 is actually a very playable option, and this is certainly something that you could consider, but I want to show you something a little bit crazier and even more wild. And the point of this move is that tactically, this knight is again defended. This is the kind of thing that white needs to look out for. Uh-oh, it's a fork, and you're losing your queen. So obviously, this would just simply not be possible for white. So what instead will opponents do? Well, most of the time they're going to be playing knight to a3 because after all, this is a defensive resource that's very typical for white, and the game might continue something like pawn to e5 and away you go. Black is going to have a very easy time getting all of the pieces out. Look, we've defended this knight now. This looks very pleasant for black. However, I do want to suggest that after they take back with the pawn, there is another very interesting move that can lead to some very fun complications, and it's this move, bishop to f5, insisting on the idea of playing knight to c2. Now, This leaves this knight hanging two different ways, which is kind of amusing, and still most of the time players will be playing knight to a3. However, I do, before we get into that, just want to kind of back up and see what happens if the opponent does decide to take with one of the pawns. Now, it's easy enough to rule out this option, which is if they open up the d file, you're obviously going to have a very nasty attack. And the strongest move here for black, in fact, is knight to bishop to c2. And the idea is that we are attacking the queen, but more importantly, we are setting up this threat of checkmate on the d1 square. So in this line, white is going to be forced to give up a queen. Obviously, that's not going to work out. But what if white keeps the d file closed and decides to take with the b pawn? Well, here you have this idea. Okay, let's go through with our idea. If you don't stop knight to c2, we might as well play it. And maybe white is actually kind of forced to play into this, because if they do anything else, like, for example, they go to a d file, they might be getting themselves into a lot of trouble. Now, if we take here, we are actually threatening bishop to c2, which would be winning tons of material. So that's going to compel white to play something like knight to a3. But queen takes d5, and suddenly we are breaking into this position. White wasn't able to stop both of our threats. For example, if bishop to d2, we simply play rook to d8, and all of a sudden, there's way too much pressure on this knight. Even if you play knight to f3, which is the best computer defense, bishop to e4, and we're just threatening to remove the defender, and white is suddenly losing this game. There's no time to go like this, because we're delivering this checkmate. So what are you meant to do? Computer says best you can do is throw away one of the pieces to try to trade the queens, but obviously this is insanely winning for white. What else? If instead we get back to this position they have just taken with their pawn, we deliver this check. Most people are actually going to be bong clouding their king to e2 with the idea that now if we take the rook, we are not threatening to play bishop to c2 right away. So instead we should change our approach, realize the rook is not going anywhere, and play this very strong move, queen to d5, which is actually setting up a winning threat. And this is another amusing position that I also just want to kind of highlight on the main screen. This 73.9% of the time, opponents will be playing knight to c3, which is kind of funny, because this is checkmate in one. And all of a sudden, the opponent has just lost the game. I thought that was kind of amusing that most people just fall for a checkmate in one. Not really easy to recommend anything very strong for white. So let's come all the way back. Let's see what else is more likely. Now, the most likely line that you're going to be facing if you do come into this is that they will take with their pawn, and after bishop to f5, instead of taking this with one of their pawns, which loses, they will be playing knight to a3. And here is where you have one winning move, but you have a very surprisingly strong threat, and it occurs after queen takes d5. Now, most opponents here are going to be like, that's fine. Again, we have another amusing situation. Check this out. Pawn takes is not the best move if you ask your engine. It's bishop to e3, and obviously black is winning. But again, 95% of the time, people will be taking with a pawn. And I don't want to spoil the winning move just yet, but you now have an incredibly winning plan for black. 95% of the time, people will mess this up. And the winning move for black in this position, and there is only one winning move. So all of these turns, a lot of times when we have one winning move with black, the opponent misses it, and that's why they maybe fall in for some of these traps. But the winning move is queen to e4. The idea is that we've actually lined up with the queen. So if, for example, the bishop goes to e3, we can now play knight to d3 and win the queen this way. So for example, if you take back, we take the queen. And still, even here, you want to be a little bit careful, because it looks like, hey, wait a minute. Yet again, white has gotten 3 minor pieces for a queen, which is an incredibly fair deal, and it's going to be more about king safety. But in fact, a very important resource for us is queen to a5 in this position, forking the king and bishop, and in this way, we actually will be winning material as black. So that's something important to keep in mind. So the other options available for white is, let's say they don't play bishop to e3, but they instead decide to put their king somewhere. Like, I don't know, you're going to put your king on d1. This way, you're avoiding the knight moving and losing the queen. Well, here, you just are simply running into rook to d8, and after the bishop goes to d2, for example, we need to just set up a position where we are able to deliver a check with the knight that would be that would get out of the way so that we're able to take the queen, if that makes any sense. Well, one way to do this, actually, there's an amusing line that has happened several times, and it goes rook takes e2, and after the king takes back, you play queen to d4, and you're hoping that the king goes somewhere, that allows you to play knight to d3. Because again, it would be the same situation where again, important resource, queen to a5, winning the bishop at the end. So what are people mostly doing? Well, they mostly go to e2, allowing a very funny line, because now you can take here. And where are you meant to go with the king? Well, people keep trying to run up. They run up to f3, allowing you to deliver more checks. They don't want to go back. They just keep coming up. Queen to d4. Okay, now there's this alignment. But they've actually run so far that they get themselves to this position, which has happened at least 3 times on Lichess. And I will say to date, h6 has been the only checkmate in one played. f6, also possibly checkmate, but maybe people do not want to make Ben Feingold mad, so they never play f6. Everybody plays h6 checkmate in this position, an amusing line. But what if? Is this just like an easy win? I don't know. Like, does this just simply win? If you get to this position, do you just, the game's over, black has just won the game? Well, no. There is some unfortunate news that I need to tell you. This line is actually pretty much busted for black if the opponent just plays this move, pawn to a3. The problem is that if your knight drops back to a6, you're going to get a horrible, yucky position, but b5 is not working because simply the opponents can take in this position with this pawn, and you no longer have any sort of tactical trick. Knight takes d4 simply doesn't work. You're hoping that the queen takes and you're able to give this checkmate, but because they played a3, white's able to go here, and you no longer have any tricks, and black has lost the game. So this one is completely busted, but why don't you go ahead and bust that subscribe button for me, because we're almost to 50,000. It would really help. Bye.